Part 1. A heavy breath winter. The winter of 1935. Moscow was covered with frost. The winds from the steppe made all sounds muffled. The ground was frozen solid. The streets were dark. Only the yellow lights at the end of the street flickered in the gray mist. Christmas Eve that year was not celebrated publicly. This was a period when many religious activities were restricted, even monitored. But in the hearts of the people, Christmas could not be erased. The ceremony still took place, silently, discreetly, like a secret breath in the freezing city. The Church of St. Roun, Xenia on Spiridonovka Street, small, old, with a dark tiled roof covered with snow, became a meeting place for souls seeking a little warmth. People came quietly, in groups of 2 or 3, bowing their heads, avoiding all unnecessary noise. But as the evening wore on, the stream of people surged from all directions, mothers in scarves, old men in ushankas, children shivering in thick cotton coats. They hurried along, white breath rising like smoke, forming a thin mist that flowed around the wooden doors of the church. It looked as if the breath of all Moscow was converging at one point, compressed, pulsating. Inside the church, candlelight flickered on the stone walls. The smell of beeswax, damp furs, and old wood mingled. The choir sang softly, trying to keep the service quiet so as not to attract attention from outside. The caretaker closed some of the windows to keep the heat in, but that only made the space more stuffy as hundreds of people continued to pour in. Outside the porch, the snow fell slowly, thick and silent, but inside, the silence had no place to exist. A gentle wave of people, at first just shoulder touches, then unconscious pushes, then apologies gradually fading, until completely disappearing in the chaos of breathing and cramped space. No one knew that in just a few hours, this warm ceremony would become a terrifying obsession. The tragedy did not come from fire, not from bombs, but from a rumor as small as ashes. A person panicked, a scream echoed in the dense space, and a stuck door turned that fear into a stampede that killed hundreds of people. A Christmas night that Moscow wanted to forget but could never forget. Part 2. The dangerous church that no one recognized. The Xenia Church was built in the 18th century, when the Spiridonovka neighborhood was sparse and only a few dozen people attended the ceremonies. Its structure was simple, classic, but not at all suitable for the modern crowd. After hundreds of years, the brick walls were rotten, the wooden ceiling was worn, and the door frames were off hinges. For decades, the place was neglected in the midst of rapidly developing Moscow. Repairs were only patchwork to keep it from collapsing, with no thought to safety standards. During Stalin's time, religious buildings were even less of a priority, leaving the church as a shadow of its former self. Trembling in strong winds, having only one main wooden door and 2 small side doors was not a problem in the quiet decades. But by 1935, when religious activities were restricted and the church became a secret spiritual refuge, it had inadvertently turned into a giant bottle, with only a single neck through which people could escape in case of an accident. No one noticed. No one thought of the danger, because Christmas is something that makes people temporarily put aside their fears, even for a few hours. But that night, people still came, still crowded together. When the wooden doors closed, the heat from hundreds of people's bodies pressed up, making the glass of the door fog up. People inside could no longer see the snow falling outside. Those who came late crowded up to the wooden balcony above, an area that could only hold a few dozen people. But on Christmas night, almost 10 times that number stood packed. They leaned on the weakened railing, on the rotten beams. Every movement made the floor creak, as if they were lamenting, warning. But the choir's sound drowned out all doubts. The air was thick inside the church. The smell of human breath, fur coats, and burning candles mixed together, making many people feel short of breath. But they still tried to endure because the ceremony was not over. Children huddled close to their mothers, their hands cold but their eyes sparkling. No one wanted to leave halfway, because outside was the biting cold, and inside was the rare warmth of a gloomy winter. Outside, the snow was still falling heavily, each snowflake shining under the pale yellow light. The line of people stretched all the way to the intersection, standing silently waiting for their turn to enter. A few hot tea sellers stood huddled, blowing into their numb hands, trying to sell a few more cups of tea before the night completely fell. They looked at the crowd, not knowing that in a few hours, this very street, where they were standing, would become the place where motionless bodies were placed on the ice to count the victims. At that time, they would remember the creaking of the wooden floor, the heavy breathing, and they would understand that the disaster had begun at this moment. As silently as the snow falling outside, Part 3, the fire starts. Gossip in the dark. Around midnight, As the choir was singing its climax, the singing reverberated off the wooden ceiling and down the rows of seats. A loud crack rang out from the balcony. For a moment, no one understood what had just happened. But then an old railing, which had rotted for many years, suddenly broke. A woman lost her balance, slipped, her hands flailing in the narrow space. A man standing next to her tried to hold her, but he too was pulled along, causing both of them to crash into the people behind. The sound of the impact shook the already overloaded balcony floor. A sharp, piercing scream rang out, tearing the thick air in the church. But downstairs, the people standing tightly packed could not see anything. From that distance, the noise was distorted into a series of chaotic and vague sounds, as if echoing from the bottom of a well. The choir was still playing, making everything even more distorted. Some people looked up, but could see nothing but darkness and figures mingling on the narrow balcony. Someone near the side door heard the noise, then shouted, "It's collapsed. The ceiling is collapsed." No one knew if that person really saw anything or just panicked. But in times of constant anxiety, all it took was a small spark to ignite the fragile calm of the crowd. And that scream was that spark, falling like a hot coal on the dry grass, waiting to burst into flames. No one checked. No one dared to ask. In a flash, the whispers turned to warnings. Then the warnings turned to panic. A cold wind ran down everyone's spine, then instantly transformed into a poisonous wind of chaos that spread throughout the church. The people in front thought there was a fire behind them because they heard people banging on the railing. The people in the back thought the front was collapsing because they saw the crowd suddenly rushing towards the door. These small speculations took only a few seconds to become reality in their minds. Survival instincts rose like cornered wild animals. Everyone turned and rushed towards the main door, the heavy door that could only fit 2 people through. Now, the only point that hundreds of desperate people aimed at. The chaos spread like wildfire. Candles were knocked to the tiled floor. The tiny flames flickered and went out, leaving behind streaks of hot wax as traces of chaos. The choir fell silent in an instant, not because they stopped singing, but because the screams had swallowed it. The fragile prayers were crushed under the weight of the screams, the trampling of feet, the sound of people pounding on the wooden door, trying to find a way out. On the balcony, those who had fallen in front tried to get up but could not. Waves of people behind them rushed forward like a tidal wave. On the floor below, those standing close to the door were pushed until they could not breathe. And in the midst of all this chaos, no one remembered what had started it all. A broken railing and a rumor flickering in the darkness. Part 4. The main tragedy. The door is stuck. The people are over. The main door was pushed so hard that the hinges creaked as if about to pop off the wooden frame. But that door, which had been covered in snow all day and then frozen, could not be opened completely. A thick layer of snow as hard as rock had blocked the bottom, leaving the door only a small crack before it was stuck. The people in front could not open it any further. The people behind, not knowing the reason, continued to push forward. It only took a second for the entire crowd to become a mass of immense pressure, like water being forced into a bottle with no way out. Those standing near the door were pressed so tightly together that they could not even lift their hands. They were no longer walking by will, but by an invisible force pushing from behind. No one could take a deep breath. No one could turn around. Screams echoed throughout the dark space, mixed with hoarse pleas. Some people tried to crawl to the side to find an exit through the side door, but that door was blocked by the crowd. There was no way to squeeze through. The breath evaporated white into clumps, mixed with the smell of half-burned candle wax and damp wool, creating a suffocating feeling that choked the lungs. At the back, those who had not yet seen the door thought there was a real fire ahead, so they pushed even harder, hoping to escape death. In less than 2 minutes, the first people fell. They were pushed to their knees, slipping on the ice that melted from their shoes. And then the stream of people behind them continued to push them forward. Their bodies quickly became unintentional obstacles, causing those behind them to stumble. One fall brought 3, then 10, then a whole row of people down like dominoes. In just a moment, the church floor turned into a pile of intertwined bodies, struggling in despair. On the balcony, the scene was no better. Many people were so panicked that they jumped off the low balcony roof to find a way out, hoping to land and run outside. But they fell on the shoulders, heads, and backs of the crowd below, creating more chaos. The sound of people falling mixed with cries and prayers was cut off, making all the sounds crazy and meaningless. I didn't run, one survivor recounted years later. I was pushed. I couldn't stop. I heard bones breaking under my feet and I couldn't do anything. His words trembled as if he were still standing in the sea of people, swept along helplessly, like a piece of wood in a flood. In that cramped space, life and death were only a few centimeters apart. just the distance between keeping your balance and being pushed down. Once you fell, there was almost no chance of getting up again. Hands reaching up in desperation only touched the heels of shoes or the stretched sweaters of the people above. Right at the main door, the horror reached its peak. A pile of people piled up almost a meter high, pressed tightly into the narrow opening, as if compressed by a colossal force. The motionless bodies became a wall of living flesh, blocking everyone behind. The door creaked with pressure, its hinges about to break. From outside, a cold wind seeped in through the cracks, blowing across faces pale from lack of air, but not enough to save them from suffocation. In the chaos, the church bell began to ring. Perhaps someone accidentally hit the bell rope while trying to run, but no one heard it anymore. The bells melted into the trampling. The moaning, the cries for help gradually faded and disappeared. And then, only the sound of despair remained. Part 5. Outside. Snow, ice, and help. Outside the church, the latecomers did not understand what was happening. They only heard muffled screams from inside, loud banging on the door, and muffled cries for help that seemed to echo through the thick stone walls. As they ran closer, the first image stunned them. Pale faces pressed tightly against the narrow opening, arms reaching out in despair, moans buried under the chaotic noise. They tried to pull people out, but the pressure from inside was too great, as if an invisible force was pushing dozens of bodies toward the door. Trembling fingers pulled at their shirts, their hands, their shoulders, but they could not move anyone. Their hands were torn, blood soaked into the white snow, but the bodies in front of them were still pressed tightly as if trapped in a vice. That helplessness made many people cry in the cold, not knowing what to do other than call out to each other in panic. Some people ran to call the fire department, the militia, even the city's night patrol workers. But the Moscow winter that year was so cold that horse-drawn carriages skidded on the ice, and trucks were sluggish because their engines froze in batches. The yellow streetlights reflected off the thick ice, slowing everything down to a nightmare. Minutes passed like hours, and by the time the rescue team finally arrived, the tragedy inside the church had reached a point beyond repair. They used crowbars and axes to break open the door. Each blow shook the ice beneath their feet, cracking it into small pieces. The cold wind blew hard, causing the oil lamps to wobble. When the hinges finally gave way and the door swung open, the crowd outside froze. A mass of bodies collapsed like a black stone, sliding across the snow. The gray cold from outside rushed into the church, rushing through tangled hair, across motionless faces, and instantly extinguishing the remaining candles. In that moment, the inside of the church was plunged into complete darkness. The survivors were dragged out in a state of near exhaustion. They gasped like people who had just emerged from the water after nearly drowning, their breaths mingling in white wisps of smoke in the cold air. Their eyes were red with fear. From crying, from lack of oxygen, their hands trembled uncontrollably. Many of them could not form words, only making hoarse, intermittent sounds. Some collapsed in the snow as soon as they were freed. Their legs were weak, and they could no longer stand. Some burst into sobs. Some sat down, holding their heads, mumbling prayers in trembling voices. And there were also those who could not stand, not because they were injured, but because their feet had almost frozen after many minutes of being crushed in the crowd. Their blood could not circulate. The snow continued to fall, silently, covering both the living and the dead in a thin layer. The scene, white, cold, silent, was in stark contrast to the intense panic that had just taken place inside. Some people stood outside looking into the darkness of the church, which no one dared to enter. They understood that what remained inside was not life. Only a heavy silence continued. Part 6. The next morning. Confessions from the survivors. When the sun rose, the Moscow sky was still a leaden gray, as if not ready to open a new day. The snow from the night before had covered everything. The steps, the roof, and the bloodstains left on the stone floor. Xenia Church was no longer a place of prayer but a silent scene. Inside, wooden chairs had collapsed like dry bones. Ceremonial cloths lay scattered on the cold ground, and candle wax had congealed into white drops like tears frozen by time. Outside, more than 100 corpses were laid in 2 long rows on the churchyard. Snow covered their clothes, their hair, and their hands, still stiff in a last defensive stance. No one who witnessed dared to breathe loudly. The heaviness of the silence made them turn away to keep from crying. There were no screams, no commotion. Each family came to claim their loved ones in silence, as if afraid to break the silence that had enveloped the place. An old mother trembled as she walked up, touched her son's cold face, then withdrew her hand as if burned. She stood for a long time, not crying, just bowing her head slowly before the body. There were others who collapsed on the snow, at the sight of a familiar piece of woolen scarf, but everyone tried to hold back. Because in those days, loud crying was also something people feared. In the corner of the yard, the survivors were wrapped in thick blankets, huddled together as if to borrow each other's warmth. Their faces were ashen from the cold and from the memories still imprinted on their breaths. A young woman, her eyes red as if she had been crying for hours, recounted in sobs, "I didn't see any fire. I only heard screams." Then everything went dark. People fell on me. I fell on others. I thought I was going to die, but someone pulled my hand away. I didn't know who it was. Beside her, a middle-aged man sat with his arms crossed, his eyes looking down at the snow that was melting under the weak sunlight. His voice was low, as if talking more to himself. No one tried to hurt anyone. No one. But when people are afraid, they become water, and that water swept everything away. His words echoed and disappeared in the wind, leaving a cold void in the hearts of those around them. A teenager with a leg injury whispered that he could still clearly remember someone squeezing his hand in the darkness, but he didn't know if it was someone trying to save him or trying to hold on so he wouldn't fall. An old man sitting near the church door said he heard a baby crying under the pile of people, so soft it sounded like a cat's meow. Then it stopped. He covered his face with his hands every time he mentioned that part. Those confessions, each one carrying a deep emotional wound, spread through that gloomy morning, like the last pieces of a puzzle revealing the truth. Not because of a fire. No bombs. No enemies. Just fear. Rumors. And a door stuck in the freezing winter. Xenia Church, in the dim light of the early morning, looked like an old witness with its head bowed in shame. Snow was still falling lightly, covering everything, trying to hide the pain of the night before. But the survivors' stories could not be erased. They remain, like scratches in the memory of an entire community. Part 7. The real cause. Not a collapse. Not a fire. As the investigation proceeded, city officials entered the Xenia Church in absolute silence. They examined every wall, every beam, every trace left after the chaotic night, and the conclusion surprised many. There was no ceiling collapse. There was no trace of fire. There was no real threat that had appeared that night. It all started with an old balcony railing that broke a small incident that was not enough to cause serious danger. But it was the scream that followed that turned it into a spark of fear that spread faster than the actual fire. A misguided scream, distorted in a confined space, became a signal that made hundreds of people think that death was coming. The main door of the church, the only way out, was the fatal one. Snow and ice that had accumulated all day had frozen the lower part of the door, opening only a small crack. As the panicked crowd pressed in, the door could not withstand the pressure and became a deadly choke point. It was this blockage that turned the church into a dead end. Investigations also showed that the Xenia Church was too old, not reinforced, and lacked a standard secondary exit. The two side doors were too small for emergency use. The balcony floor, which was meant to accommodate a small group of parishioners, had to accommodate nearly 200 people on the night of the public mass. When more people than usual came to seek refuge for their religious beliefs, the church's capacity was about a third of the number who were actually present that night. No one thought of limiting it. No one stepped in to coordinate it. No one felt the need to warn. People just wanted to attend mass, sing, and pray in a harsh winter, and it was this simple desire that inadvertently put them in danger. The tragedy was not caused by a physical threat. It was not a building collapse. It was not a fire. It was the product of mass panic, of outdated architecture, of a stuck door, and of too many people rushing into a small place that was not designed to hold them. A series of small, separate, seemingly harmless elements, but when they came together at the right time, created a night of tragedy that no one could stop. The Xenia Church, the investigators concluded, was not the scene of an attack or vandalism. It was simply an old space pushed to its limits by the people who sought it. The crowd had pushed itself into danger without anyone realizing it, until it was too late to back down. Part 8. Legacy. Questions that will never be answers. After the tragedy, years passed in silence. No official announcements were made. No newspaper articles were published. The event was gently but firmly buried, as if it had never happened. In Stalin's time, news of mob violence or mismanagement was considered unseemly, and the story of Christmas 1935 was swept into a dark corner of history. But memories do not fade easily. For the families who lost loved ones, that Christmas Eve remains a wound that never heals, reopening every time winter comes. They cannot tell the story to the press, but they tell it to each other, to their children, to the cold evenings when someone stares at the ceiling and wonders how a scream could kill so many people. Each family keeps a piece of memory, a woolen scarf, a hymn book, a pair of gloves, small relics that weigh as much as the sky of the past. The Xenia Church closed for many years after the disaster. The main door, which was once stuck, has been repaired. But the traces of that night are still etched in every piece of wood. As Moscow gradually modernized, the Spiridonovka neighborhood became more crowded and bustling. But the old church still stood there silent, modest, like a witness no one wanted to mention. The gray brick, the sunken wooden roof, the small windows always misted with fog. All of it made it look like a forgotten ghost in a city that had entered a new era. Locals say that if they pass by the church late at night, when the snow is falling heavily and the wind is blowing through the cracks in the doors, they sometimes hear a faint sound coming from inside. It's unclear whether it's the wind or the creaking wood, but some say it sounds like a choir interrupted the unfinished music of that Christmas Eve. Others swear they've heard footsteps running across the wooden floor, then suddenly silenced as if swallowed by darkness. These stories are unverified, and no one wants to verify. They exist as part of a collective memory, both vague and terrifying. Disasters don't always come from fire or steel. Sometimes, they come from a scream, a door that gets stuck, and panic spreads faster than any fire. The words rang out like a sad summary of history, a reminder that people are not only afraid of tangible things, but can also be overcome by their own fears. Finally, a distant bell rang from an unknown church, perhaps a synagogue a few blocks away. The bells carried on the cold air, ringing like a trail of memory. They did not summon people to mass. They merely reminded that what was buried still existed somewhere, under the snow, under the silence, under the pages of history that were not written. And so, the legacy of the Christmas disaster of 1935 lay not in the official records, but in the vague vibrations of memory which still echoed every time winter covered Moscow.